From NPR and WBUR, I'm Peter O'Dowd.
I'm Robin Young. It's Here and Now, and we want to start right in on Attorney General William Barr's move last night in a memo to federal prosecutors to give them authorization to investigate specific instances of voter fraud. Barr also warned that specious, speculative, fanciful, or far-fetched claims should not be a basis for initiating federal inquiries. So what does that mean? Trevor Potter is founder and president of the Nonpartisan Campaign Legal Center, former chair of the Federal Election Commission, as well as general counsel to the late John McCain's 2 presidential bids. Trevor Potter, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Robin. It's great to be with you.
And as you well know, immediately Richard Pilger, head of the Justice Department's Election Crimes Branch, resigned in protest over AG Barr's letter to prosecutors. What did you make of it when you heard of the letter?
Well, first of all, the resignation tells us that this is something that career Justice Department people think is wrong. The reason for that is that elections are run at the state level, and there is no federal role here in the states determining who won. So this is a departure from department policy. I will say that the Attorney General made it clear that, first of all, this was an authorization for prosecutors to look, not a command that they must do so. But secondly, he said only in those cases where the alleged violations could affect the result of the election. Let me give you an example of a specific allegation. In Nevada, the Trump campaign alleged that there were at least 3,000 Nevadans who had illegally voted, saying that they had voted in the election even though they had filed change of address forms to out of state. And I mention that because here's what we now know about Nevada. They alleged there were 3,000 illegal voters. The margin in Nevada is far larger than that. So even if true, those 3,000 voters would not affect the election. Then it turned out when they released the list that many of the voters on that list were military and allowed under Nevada law to vote in Nevada while they were posted out of state. Some of them were college students who reside in Nevada and were in college out of state. They too are allowed to vote. So the point is, you can make allegations of fraud. That doesn't mean they are proven. So I think that tells you that Barr is authorizing, whether because of pressure from Trump or what other reason, he is authorizing his prosecutors to look at such allegations. It doesn't mean that they're going to come up with anything, and it certainly doesn't mean they would be large enough to affect the election result in any state, but it's still unprecedented.
I know you want to talk about Pennsylvania. The administration is alleging there that Republican observers weren't allowed to get close enough to where the election workers were counting ballots. This could have been because of social distancing measures. What else did you want us to know about Pennsylvania?
That suit is different because it's in federal court. It could conceivably go to the Supreme Court, and it asks for the sort of relief we have never imagined out of a federal court in an election in this country.
And of course, the fear is that if anything goes to the Supreme Court, it's a Supreme Court in which President Trump has 3 appointees. Just briefly, the Republican Party seems to be cannibalizing itself here. In Georgia, the Republican senators David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler are calling on Georgia's Republican Secretary of State to step down. They say there was voter fraud there. He says that's laughable. But again, he's a Republican. You have, the Republican governors and attorney generals and other secretaries of state in other states saying, we are Republicans. We do this well. Do you see, just to be clear, Trevor, do you see anything anywhere in any of the claims that would amount to the kind of fraud that could overturn this election?
No, I do not. So far, we have seen nothing that is either of the sort of the character or the size that would constitute fraud sufficient to overturn the election in any of these states. I think what you're seeing here is not Republican versus Republican. You are seeing the professionals of both parties who are responsible for running elections and feel they did a remarkably good job in the middle of a pandemic with none of the disasters that were predicted, suddenly being attacked by ideologically motivated politicians with no evidence at all saying it's all fraudulent. And they find that personally offensive and professionally offensive and dangerous to the country because it suggests to the public, particularly Trump voters, that somehow a Biden election, if that's where we end up, as seems likely, is illegitimate. And that may be Trump's goal, but it is certainly not the goal of the professionals of both parties who run elections and rely on public confidence in their work.
By the way, do you mind if I ask, are you Republican?
I am historically Republican. I have worked for Republican candidates for many offices. I'm currently running a nonprofit, which is nonpartisan.
Trevor Potter, founder and president of the Campaign Legal Center, that nonprofit. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robin, very much.
The U.S. Supreme Court heard the latest legal challenge to the Affordable Care Act today. At issue is whether the individual mandate is constitutional. That's the provision requiring people to maintain a minimum amount of health insurance coverage, and a ruling against it could put the health care of more than 20 million people at risk. The new 6-3 conservative majority on the court will also be closely watched as this case plays out. Joining us now is Larry Levitt. He's Executive Vice President for Health Policy at the Kaiser Family Foundation. Larry, welcome.
Thank you.
And the key legal term in this case here is severability. And today, Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh both suggested that the rest of the law could stand if the individual mandate fell. How do you interpret what you heard today?
Well, many people, including me, came away from today's oral arguments thinking that there might be a majority on the court, including Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh, to support the idea that even if the individual mandate is unconstitutional, the rest of the ACA shouldn't be thrown out as well. It's always you always have to be careful interpreting these oral arguments because the justices often play devil's advocate and push arguments that they may not agree with just to see how the attorneys will answer them. But particularly Kavanaugh and Roberts seem to suggest that they weren't prepared to throw out the whole law.
The issue of the intent or will of Congress also came up quite a few times today. What can you tell us about that?
That's right, and this case, it's a little hard to get your head around this case. Back in 2012, when the Supreme Court first considered the Affordable Care Act, they ruled that the individual mandate was constitutional, not because it was okay for the federal government to require people to buy insurance or command them to do so, but because that's not really what the ACA did. The ACA gave people a choice. You could either buy insurance or pay a tax penalty to the federal government. What is different now is that Congress in 2017 got rid of the tax penalty. They set the tax penalty to zero. So there's no longer a tax penalty associated with the individual mandate. So there's some question as to whether the individual mandate itself is now unconstitutional. It's a toothless individual mandate with no penalty. And then the question is, if you throw the individual mandate out, what was the intent of Congress when it did set that tax penalty to zero? Did it really intend to, throw the entire law out, including protections for people with pre-existing conditions, or do you go back, way back to 10 years ago when the ACA originally passed, when most people believed that the individual mandate was in fact central to making the law work?
Well, as you say, this is not the first time the Affordable Care Act has come before the Supreme Court, but it is the first time that there's been a 6-3 conservative majority, and it's definitely the first time that Justice Amy Coney Barrett has heard a case on Obamacare. What did you see from her today?
She asked, all the justices asked very good questions, including Justice Barrett. She also seemed to express some skepticism around issues of standing, whether these plaintiffs even have the ability to bring the suit. Are they really harmed by an individual mandate with no penalty? But totally reading between the lines, it felt like she was inclined to throw the law out. But again, you really can't tell a lot from these oral arguments always.
Yeah, we're going to have to wait to hear how they rule, of course. The other change is that a Democrat, Joe Biden, will be in the White House when this ruling does finally come down. And we don't yet know the makeup of Congress after this election. So depending on the outcome at the Supreme Court, what do you think is next?
Well, one of the things that made this case a political lightning rod was that President Trump supported the case to throw the ACA out rather than defending the ACA as a federal law, which would be much more typical. President-elect Biden, of course, supports the ACA and has vowed to build on it. But as president, Joe Biden couldn't just unilaterally make this case go away. Congress could. I mean, there are several easy legislative fixes Congress could pass to make this case moot. But those fixes likely depend on Democrats being in charge in the Senate. So, the future of the ACA could come down to these 2 Senate runoffs in Georgia in January.
And we'll keep an eye on it if it does. Larry Levitt, Executive Vice President for Health Policy at the Kaiser Family Foundation. Thank you very much for your insight. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
More than 10 million people in the United States have tested positive for COVID-19, and as that number soars, so does demand for testing. But what kind of tests are available, and how reliable are they? We're joined now by Dr. Daniel Rhodes. He's the section head of microbiology at the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio. He's on Skype. Dr. Rhodes, welcome, and thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Peter. It's good to be here.
Yeah, so there are 3 types of tests, and let's start by briefly ticking through each one of them. How about the molecular test, or it's otherwise known as the PCR test?
Sure, yeah. So the molecular test looks for the viral RNA. So the coronavirus has RNA as its genome instead of DNA, and so we use different molecular tests to try to detect if that's in somebody's specimen. So PCR is the most common molecular test, and it's generally considered the gold standard because it's the most sensitive.
And is this the one that is most likely to be the nasal swab inside the nose?
Yep. This is a nasal swab. Early on in March, they were doing throat swabs, but now pretty much everybody's doing a nasal swab.
And you say it's the gold standard. How accurate is it?
So when it's positive, it's very accurate. There's still a subset of patients who have disease and are going to test negative. We've realized that's the case. If there's viral RNA in the sample, it's going to pick it up.
All right. So then there's the antigen test, otherwise known as the rapid test. What about that one?
So the antigen tests are different in a few ways. You still need a swab, but you can't get a swab just at the front of the nose. You need to get as much virus as you can on that swab. So they go all the way to the back of the nose. That's the nasopharyngeal swab. And also, oftentimes, the specimen's completely used up in the test. It's kind of once and done. But it's very quick, which is why people like it.
So here's what I don't understand. At your hospital, you're doing 1,000 tests a day, right? How do you decide which patient should get an antigen test or a molecular test? And me as a patient, if I were to get one of those tests, how would I know which one I'm getting? It doesn't matter.
So at the Cleveland Clinic, we're not currently using antigen testing. We've put our effort into ramping up the PCR platforms, but it's always good to start with the goal. Is the goal to be quick, or is the goal to be as sensitive as possible, or is the goal to be as cheap as possible? So if you want to be as sensitive as possible, then you want to do a PCR test. If you have somebody with symptoms and you're pretty sure they have COVID and you want a really quick result, then an antigen test is a reasonable approach.
I see. And tell me about these spit tests. Where do they fit into all this?
Sure. So all the spit tests currently are PCR tests.
The gold standard.
Yeah. So it's another way to try to get the virus into the tube. So this whole spit test came about because early on, and still we're having supply chain issues, but early on the problem was getting enough swabs to even collect specimens. So people, started 3D printing swabs or saying maybe we don't need a swab at all. Maybe if somebody just spits in the tube, we'll be able to detect the virus. And again, it depends on the goals. It depends on the constraints of the lab. So, everything has a place. It's just, where does it fit?
Okay, and some people might be thinking, if I get a spit test, well, maybe that's not quite as accurate as getting the swab up the nose, but it sounds like you're saying that the spit test is a molecular test, which is the gold standard, which is pretty reliable.
So nothing's easy these days. So it depends. It also depends how the specimen's collected. So, one of my colleagues did a study, and they did enhanced saliva. So they kind of snort, and then you cough, and then you spit it out into the tube. But there is the potential that saliva testing could be as good as a nasal swab if it's collected the right way and tested the right way.
Well, I don't want to forget about the third type of test. Of course, that is the antibody test, which tells you if you've been infected at some point along the way with the coronavirus. Tell me about those and why that's important if in many or all cases you're no longer showing symptoms of the disease.
Yeah, so we're also asking ourselves that, when do we use an antibody test? How is that helpful clinically? So one measure they can look at is antibody response. So it's helpful for vaccine studies. It's also helpful for prevalence studies to see how many people may have gotten sick and never gotten a test in the first place. So for epidemiological purposes or surveillance purposes, it can provide interesting information about the public.
And tell me if I'm wrong, but that's a blood test, right?
Yep, that's a blood test. Although, people are looking at, can you detect antibodies in saliva? I mean, people are always looking for a new way, a better way to do testing.
Well, early in the pandemic, we were concerned because there weren't enough tests, and the results that we did have were taking a really long time to process. Now, speaking from personal experience, my family just got a test result this weekend in a little more than a day. As a country, how are we doing right now in terms of testing? Are we where we need to be?
That's a good question. You have lots of good questions. So we're definitely better off than we were in March or April or May, but it's not at all smooth yet. Every day I'm personally dealing with, crises in the laboratory. Do we have enough pipette tips? Did that shipment come in so that we can keep testing on that test system? So we're in a much better place than we were, but I don't think anybody would say we're where we need to be yet.
Dr. Daniel Rhodes, section head of microbiology at the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio. Doctor, I was hoping to have really easy answers here.
Unfortunately, nothing is easy these days.
It's true, but you know what? That was very helpful and clarifying. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
Well, Democrats had hoped to turn Texas blue in the 2020 election, but as we know, that did not happen. President-elect Joe Biden lost the state by about 6 points, and Republicans actually gained support in southern Texas along the U.S. border with Mexico, an area that's really pretty reliably blue. Valerie Gonzalez is a reporter with the Monitor newspaper in McAllen, Texas, and she's been gathering some local reaction near the border there. Valerie, welcome. Good to speak with you.
Hi, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, and as I said, counties along the Texas border, traditionally pretty Democratic, but the support eroded this time around. What happened?
It caught everyone off guard. I don't think that either party, from speaking to them before the election, expected the results that we got. I think everybody felt that this was an awakening.
Well, the Republican Party, let's just tick through some of the numbers here to give people context. The Republican Party made significant gains in the Rio Grande Valley. In Starr County, the president got 47% of the vote this year, compared to just 19% of the vote in 2016 against Hillary Clinton. Republicans must be thrilled. What are you hearing from them?
I spoke to the Republican chair in Starr County, and he didn't realize what the turnout would be until the second week of early voting. That's when he started realizing that there were more and more people who were going over to him and telling him that they had voted for Trump, that he started to realize they were going to make a significant gain in their support this year. So it was unexpected for everyone.
But do you have any sense of why? Because in Florida, for instance, we saw Latino voters, people of Cuban descent, for instance, break in favor of President Trump. The reason was because the message about Democrats being socialists seemed to resonate there in Florida. But why in Texas, along the border, where many of the people are of Mexican descent, why did Trump do so well there? Does anyone have any theories?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people think that immigration is going to be something that really stands out to the Mexican-American voter, but that's not really the case, or at least not in Starr County, where the community is sustained by three main employers: the city, the county, and the school district. And if you don't get a job with them, you have to travel further to find a job. And a lot of people there work in the oil industry. So when they heard that Biden was kind of wavering in his support for the oil industry and his support for the renewable energy, that definitely caused concern for people there with those jobs. But when we hear about immigration on a greater scale, things like the migrant protection protocols or the Remain in Mexico program, those things are a little further away from home, so they tend to focus more on what affects them directly. And what affects them the most is job security.
And you're referring to the policy that the Trump administration put into place that requires migrants applying for asylum in the United States to wait, in many cases, many months on the Mexican side of the border. You also note that in Hidalgo County, turnout was lower than in the northern part of the state, so that's going to have Democrats very concerned. And I also want to ask you about a trip that you took to Mexico, to Matamoros, just over the border, soon after the Associated Press called the race for Joe Biden. Here's a clip from one of the migrants you spoke with. His name is Danilo, and he's from Honduras.
Que vean en Estados Unidos, ¿verdad? Pues que lo que hace Trump no es bueno. No es bueno.
In English, he's saying there the U.S. should see that what Trump did was not good. Did you get a sense of relief from people in those camps when they looked at the election results?
Yes. Migrants follow the news very closely. So they know what Biden's platform is, and they're hoping that he acts on it soon so that they can go ahead and go through their asylum court hearings.
What has Biden said about his policy for those migrants in those camps?
Well, he said he would end MPP within the first 100 days, and migrants will definitely be holding him to that.
Right, I'm sure they will be. Valerie Gonzalez, a reporter with the Monitor newspaper in McAllen, Texas. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
We're about 8 months into the pandemic in the U.S., and the retail industry is still adapting. The coronavirus changing the way Americans shop, maybe forever. And that means American mainstays, department stores, other mall-based retailers are rethinking the way they reach customers. Let's bring in Robin Farzad, host of Public Radio's Full Disclosure. Hi, Robin.
Hello.
Let's start with one of those mainstays. JCPenney struck a deal in bankruptcy court yesterday, saving some 60,000 jobs. One of several retailers, including J. Crew, Neiman Marcus, Brooks Brothers, to file for bankruptcy in the pandemic. But how does saving those jobs and, coming through bankruptcy help in the long term?
The alternative was a spiral into liquidation, which not only would have erased tens of thousands of JCPenney jobs, but would also have inundated the retail property market with all of that empty space just when it least needed that. So you saw players with typically differing strategic interests kind of hold their nose and unite just to buy this brand and themselves more time.
Right. But, big box stores and places in, malls have been dying for years. Many are now having to close almost entirely during the pandemic. But what's to say that this decline of malls isn't going to keep happening?
Yeah, what's your reason for going to the mall right now? And if we're talking Black Friday, are you going to brave COVID worries to fight for those doorbusters? Amazon and others, they're matching online anyway. So prior to the pandemic, as you know, we were well into the obsolescence of the American mall. We've talked about Sears, old record stores, Radio Shack. The value proposition of that communal experience was just diminishing. And we know that mall operators have been scrambling to make a better case. Carousels, rock climbing, food halls. And that's all up in the air thanks to everything that has happened since March.
Well, there's partnerships happening. Target is announcing it's partnering with Ulta Beauty to build Ulta shops within the Target stores. Maybe Ulta's hoping to cash in. Maybe Target is. What's happening there?
Yeah, they offer one another something unique right now. Target actually has had a great year. It's an essential business that has mainly stayed open with all of those omni-channel bells and whistles, fulfillment, delivery, returns, online. Ulta, until the pandemic, was one of the hottest niche players in all of retail. But think about how impossible face-to-face contact and perfume spraying and makeup brushes have been. So now they need the feet already in the door at Target. And Target, frankly, it could do worse than to share its overhead with a hot retail brand. We've already seen them do that with CVS and Starbucks.
Yeah. Look, a new report, serious real estate report, showed that 89% of major chains paid their rent in October. That's the highest level since the pandemic started. But Robin, maybe I'm going to give too much information here, but I've been wearing the same Athleta pants for 8 months. I just went through summer clothes and realized hadn't worn any of them. And we're hearing of a surge coming. People really aren't buying clothes, are they?
And
they're
it's
wearing
not
the
about
same
apparel.
things.
It's about keeping the leases together. Landlords have had to shell out so much rent relief this year just to keep tenants. So even that number that you're seeing, 89% of rents being paid, do we know how many renegotiations were done? Do we know how many movie chains are involved in this? Home improvement has been great. It's not just about apparel. It's about averting an outright commercial real estate depression by these landlords.
But I have divulged too much, haven't I? Wearing the same
It's
pants
all right.
for
We're
8
all
months.
in sweatpants. We're all in athleisure wear.
I hear you're not wearing any pants. Robin Farzad, host of Public Radio's Full Disclosure, thank you.
My pleasure.
President-elect Biden is forging ahead planning a coronavirus response. And for public health expert Dr. Lena Wen, that can't come soon enough. Her recent Washington Post op-ed makes it clear. She writes, Biden's top priority must be to level with the American people and tell us the hard truths. It's titled, President Biden, Get to Work. Dr. Wen is an emergency physician and public health professor at George Washington University. She previously served as Baltimore's health commissioner. She's a frequent contributor to CNN and Here and Now. So Dr. Wen, Lena, welcome back.
Nice to talk to you as always, Robin.
Yeah, let's get right to it. You say Biden needs to start having fireside chats like Roosevelt did, put his health experts on daily briefings. What else?
Well, the most important thing right now is this idea that we cannot wait. Between now and January 20th, we could have more than 2,000 people a day dying from coronavirus. We've already wasted 8-9 months due to inaction, and we just cannot wait. And so President-elect Biden can actually do a lot because what he doesn't have in executive power, he does have in moral authority. And so being able to speak directly to the American people is a major start, because he can convince and needs to start enlisting trusted messengers who can also help to convey that message for him as well. In addition, he can come up with a national plan and get the buy-in now from governors and mayors. He may not have the executive power, but they do. And so he can start having this national framework in place that, of course, we should have had a long time ago. But that work doesn't need to wait until January 20th.
Well, you say also if he reaches out, let's say, to mayors, it gives them cover. If he not only reaches out, but starts talking about the mandates that he wants to put in place or wants them to put in place, then it gives them cover to do it if a governor has not.
That's right. I think it's particularly important in areas where the mayors or county executives may want to do the right thing or have been trying to do the right thing. They've been trying to put into place mask mandates or have been trying to do restrictions on certain types of high-risk businesses, but are finding that mayors and county executives in other surrounding areas are not doing this. And that's why that piecemeal approach has been so harmful. This is an opportunity now for President-elect Biden to get the buy-in from as many governors and mayors as possible, many of whom are already trying to do the right thing, get them to come together, have a national strategy around things like testing, contact tracing, getting supplies. He can put into place all these various pieces now, and again, not wait until January 20th.
Look, speaking to the urgency that we hear in your voice, Ashish Jha, the dean at Brown School of Public Health, says, as you do, we're on track to go from 1,000 deaths a day to 2,000 by December. As families gather, people drop their guard. But he's directing his ire and his tweets at people, asking them to make these demands of President Trump. Tell the Trump administration, do your job. We pay them, is one of the things he's written. Are you expecting a lot from Biden, who isn't in office yet, as we are hearing, doesn't have access to tools that he might need? Probably if he has fireside chats or has a task force speaking every day, it won't be picked up by Fox, which, is where Trump supporters are getting their information and don't believe, as we know, largely don't believe in masks. I mean, what can he do with people who won't listen to him?
You make a very good point that you can have the best policies in place, but they're not going to have much effect if people don't literally follow that guidance. And that's why I hope that President-elect Biden will do a lot more to enlist those in particular who did not support him politically. So reaching out on the local community level to pastors, to heads of chambers of commerce. There are so many individuals who